tremendously helpful summary, Mike, and gives us quite a lot to think about, I think, in the subsequent discussion. I'm aware of the time. I think we've reached the point where we need to bring in Pedro Teixeira, and I wish to respect his timetable, and invite him to speak.
No, I think he starts later at 11, I think.
The hand that moves me tells me that we can let the discussion flow at this point. Is that right?
All right.
Okay. How long for? Let's make a decision. 1:45? Okay. We'll let it run for up to 10, 12 minutes. Yeah, okay. Is that okay with you, Pedro? It will cut your discussion time short a little, I think. Okay. Good. At this point, I invite our face-to-face and online audience to come in with their question and discussion points. And we have 2 hands up. I'll take the one in the back first. It would be a good idea.
Thank you so much for this very interesting book presentation. I'm Iris Lechner. I'm from the philosophy department of the VU. I have 2 questions, if that's okay. So I have one for Anniko. You told about the student involvement. I was wondering, you sketched the picture that students, well, they are formally included, but they don't really have a voice. I wonder if you also have some success stories from the different countries or the different interviews that you, some success stories where students were actually involved and their voices were actually heard. And I also have a question for Jürgen. You on the slide it said that success, not failure, undermines the normative basis of higher education, and I was wondering if you could elaborate on that more, because I think the success of higher education actually strengthened its normative basis, but maybe I misunderstood about this. Thanks.
Should I start briefly? Okay, so yes, of course, as I mentioned, there are degrees. So for example, in Norway, we see that many of the processes that, let's say, we observe as at the extreme in the UK in terms of student restriction in their possibility to act on what they would like to achieve, it's much stronger. So in terms of welfare issues, they have a really big say. They are listened to. Their funding is much more secure. For example, one of the issues that we also talk in the chapter about is about student funding and how that makes it impossible for them sometimes to pursue more radical issues, and that's a bit different in Norway. But what was interesting, that despite of them being much better funded, despite of them having a bigger say in how they run their affairs, they still had, and partly because of the external pressures that they had to face, they still had the feeling that they cannot actually achieve and change fundamentally the things that make their life as students difficult and challenging. And for example, even in Norway, the student graduation number, so many students start the university, but it's much less who actually finish and get a degree. It's not higher or better, for example, in any of the other countries where we did the research. If anything, that sometimes it's lower, and it's system issues as well that influence that. But yes, but we do have, or you have success stories when they present it individually. For example, if they have really good relations, personal relations with a rector, then they feel that they can achieve lots of things. But that's very personal. It's structurally undermined, which means that then the next incoming student administration might have really difficulties because they have a different personality. So, okay, Jürgen.
Yeah, it's a good question actually, because I mean, what I'm trying to say is, historically speaking, I think there were different forms of the university being an institution, being loaded by norms, values, beliefs, you could say, as a shortcut. And I think this has been changing. That would be my argument. Maybe we see a process of re-institutionalization. That's possible. But I was mainly speaking now towards the process of deinstitutionalization. So classical beliefs, norms, values attached to the university, that, by the way, that links to Aniko's point, produces something like institutionalized trust vis-a-vis the organization, that is, I think, is in decline. And I could now quote many authors who would agree with me, but that is not always a very good point. But I personally think it is in decline. It is moving towards a more utilitarian perspective. You do no longer, let me put it in a nutshell, you do no longer get support, and I do not only mean financial support, you do no longer get support simply because you are a university, but you get support because of what you achieve as a university. And that changes things a lot and tells us a lot about what is happening in terms of ideational field dynamics. Hope that sheds some more light on it.
I think you had a question.
So let's do this first. Yeah.
Someone
I think that's because they are like probably very
Hello. Thank you very much for this informative session. It is a very complex context of higher education. First of all, are many differences, and secondly, are important intersections between horizontal and vertical spaces of higher education. What are the possible recommendations for efficient communication in higher education? Thank you.
Colleagues, which of you will answer Victoria Triff's question? Do you know what the question was?
I couldn't hear the question.
Victoria, I'm sorry, but we don't have a clear idea of what you've asked, because we were about to take a question from the floor here when you came in, and it sort of threw us all off balance a bit. Can you repeat the question?
What are the possible recommendations for suggesting a common context for efficient communication?
So
what to do?
Communication is the issue, colleagues. Efficient communication. We're talking about governance in relation to communication. Is that right?
I think you should answer that. Me?
I think she answered internal communication.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm now have been elected to respond to that. Well, I'm probably the most unlikely person to do so, because I have no idea what effective communication is, to be honest. How can I say? Maybe the best way to respond is there is a very interesting stream of research in organization studies that highlights the role of communication within organizations for their functioning. But that is not so much about effective communication. It is rather about communication as a means of intra-organizational power struggles, you could say. And that is not a critique that I'm making here, because I think if organizations would not have power struggles, they go stalemate. So it's a good thing to have power struggles. That's all I can say about this.
We did have another question from the floor here, so I'll take that question now, if that's okay.
Let's see if this, yeah, brilliant. So, I mean, I'm pretty broad intellectual, and you could say I come from like the Queen position. And in the last couple of days, my observation has been that actually the university has become a bureaucracy. The university, this is purely my observation, this is like my thought, that we are facilitating, as it were, like government institutional preference. So we're actually writing, as it were, reports for government subsidies. We're not busy with what is my, like, observing, as it were, priorities regarding science. What is fundamental going on in the world, in society, etc. That's how I see it, as an idealized, humanistic, enlightenment position. I know. There's so. What would you say in regards to that? We're actually facilitating system and a culture versus the ideal and the method of science.
Well, it's an interesting point. I'll pick up the question online as well. I think there are two factors which have driven change in universities in a sort of social communication sense. One is size, and size is really important. And the other is digitization. I mean, when I was, all those years ago, a registrar of a fairly successful university, I used to have a colleague who was head of the business school, and I used to arrive early in order to do some work before the balloon went up, as it were. He realized this, and he used to phone me always at 8 o'clock in the morning to get a decision on something. Secondly, it was well known in the university that I lunched in a particular place within the university, and people would come up and ask questions or raise issues, thereby ruining my lunch, but actually providing, you know, a pretty good method of communication. And I think size in particular has been a problem in universities. I was in my old university just a week ago, and the Vice Chancellor said proudly to me, we've got 29,000 students now. It was 17,000 when I was registrar. And he was really pleased that he got 29,000 students, but he had actually no idea why he should be pleased. It was just size that was the problem. And the net result is that the communication within the university has clearly changed. So I think universities do need to think to themselves how they actually connect with their academic staff. Otherwise, what happens is that academics are simply isolated in small departmental groups and can exercise very little influence on executive teams and rectors who are powerful, and maybe lay boards of governors.
Thanks, Mike. And interestingly, Victoria's off-centre question has prompted some reflections about communication, which have been useful. We've received a message in the chat which says that I do not have a view of the room. Is the camera on? And we probably need to make sure the camera is on, colleagues. Now, at this point, it's a great pleasure to invite Pedro Teixeira, valued colleague, valued academic colleague, valued colleague in the field of higher education, advising to policy, and now, of course, a policy maker and system administrator. Pedro Teixeira is the Secretary of State for Higher Education in the Portuguese government. He's also a professor in economics in the Faculty of Economics at the University of Porto, where his work on the economics of education has been very important. And he's director of CPES, which is a dynamic research centre in Europe in our field, Centre of Research on Higher Education Policy, CPES. Good that you've maintained your chair and the directorship, Pedro, and we look forward to your address.
Well, thank you very much. I had actually a presentation, but it's actually a set of notes, so there's no point. It probably will make the discussion more interactive. I'm very grateful for the invitation. It's really a pleasure and an honor. Although I feel a little bit embarrassed because some of the people in this room know much more about governance than I do, and certainly I wouldn't be qualified. I haven't done research for a couple of years due to my current responsibilities to do a keynote lecture. Actually, what I prepared is much more a set of comments based on the book, comments that and questions and reflections that have been inspired by reading the book, and I take the opportunity to commend the authors for the quality of the work. And I think one of the criteria by which we assess the quality of the book is how much it made us think about or rethink about specific issues, but also made me connect to other concerns that I have, and I think that a lot of my comments will be very much biased by my current responsibilities, some of which have been concerns that precede this current life, but I think certainly they are connected to I think they're very much connected to the last 2 years. I won't go into much detail about sort of contextualizing issues of governance and the complexity of governance, all of that, because I think all of us that are participating in the seminar are familiar with it. But I think that, so I'll go straight into some of the main issues that I think the volume raises. The first one, I would probably call it the decline of institutional autonomy. And that has been a concern of mine, I think pre-March 2022, but it has become much more a vivid concern in the last 2 years because of what I've been observing in my own country, but also in other European countries. In many ways, I think the volume raises the concern that we are facing sort of the end of an era that many of us have lived through the last 30 years. The combination of autonomy and accountability, and that used to sound as a sort of virtuous combination in which we would give more autonomy to institutions, and institutions would become much more engaged with society, we would become much more relevant, and the state would retrench from previous intrusive, detailed control of higher education institutions. This, of course, was much more relevant for continental Europe than it was for the UK, where there was a strong tradition of institutional autonomy. And actually, we all remember comparative volumes organized by colleagues at CHEPS in the late 80s, 90s, in which we would say, well, in some ways there is convergence because continental European institutions are becoming more autonomous. British universities are becoming less autonomous, so there is a sense of convergence there. I think one of the questions for us, of course, is why do we get this sense that we're coming, I hope I'm not being sort of excessive here, coming to the end of an era in terms of institutional autonomy, or why do we start getting worried about the decline of institutional autonomy? I think we could make an argument about regulatory changes, and I think some of the dimensions some of the changes I think are related to that. I would tend to emphasize the developments in terms of quality assurance, and especially accreditation, as I think it is illustrated by several of the interviewees in the book, because it was a way of constraining what core missions of universities in Europe And I think part of the constraint was even more effective because it's been legitimized by academics. The fact that a lot of the accreditation is done by our peers, in the same way that a lot of the research assessment is done by our peers, has made much more difficult, on the one hand, for us as academics to refuse that, because, how could we contest something that was validated by experts in our field? And secondly, I think because it was done by peers, in some ways, our initial response was much more willing to accept those kinds of judgments than if it was done by administrators or by civil servants. And I think that's one of one of the vehicles through which institutional autonomy was increasingly challenged in Europe. The other one, of course, is funding. And I think that we moved away from, again, sort of this, I know that I'll be exaggerating, the golden era of the late 20th century where they had this lump sum funding. But the fact that increasingly funding moves towards, performance-based funding, the introduction of output indicators, and especially the dimensions of contractualization, I think have been, again, much more intrusive. Even though, and again, I think that in many ways, this has been legitimized by the higher education sector. Just a side comment, I've been, over the last months, coordinating the review of our funding system, and we presented the model in August. And one of the main criticisms that we received from the institutions was that we didn't introduce performance indicators. And actually, some of the rectors came out publicly criticizing that one of the weaknesses of the new system was that, and although we said no, the next 4 years, so the proposal, by the way, it's probably not very relevant for this audience, but I will contextualize a bit, was the idea that we don't have at the moment, we haven't used funding formula and funding criteria for 12 years. And I said, well, I think we need to start this as a learning exercise. So the first step will be, we need to think which are the areas of performance that we want to value in our system. Secondly, we need to choose a small set of criteria, because if we choose 20 criteria for each dimension, it will be useless and will be extremely confusing and excessive for the institutions. And thirdly, secondly, we will give time for the institutions to think internally which areas of development they value most, and which criteria they think that they would choose to be assessed. And the final step for the last 2 years of this 4-year period will be that we run this as a sort of formative exercise. So without any implication in terms of funding, but just as a learning exercise, how do institutions perform according to the areas of development and the criteria that they all selected? And the subsequent government in 27 will then decide if they want to translate this now into having a direct link with funding, but it will be up to the next government to decide. But by then, he or she will be the minister, will have a set of criteria, a set of performance areas, and all the process in the institutions will be much more organized. And I thought that, well, being an academic, and I never forget that I'm an academic, I thought that actually this was a rather benevolent exercise and a way of thinking. It would give time for institutions to think about this exercise. So it's quite striking that it was the institutions, the ones that criticized the fact that we introduced immediately performance-based funding. And I think that plays clearly in terms of my argument. The other stream of sort of factors that I think influenced this change in, let's say, the decline of institutional autonomy is the sort of all the discussion about quasi-markets and marketization. And I think in many ways this has been very challenging for many institutions, because we had a juxtaposition of state interference and sort of the market interference. In many ways, the state was also present in the marketization, as we know. Quasi-markets in many ways were engineered by state policies or government policies. But instead of having the substitution of some criteria, some demands by others, in many ways we have the accumulation of demands and regulations, and the need to respond. We know from the Bible that we shouldn't serve two masters at the same time, but I think higher education has been asked to serve two masters, and this has been, I think, problematic to many institutions, and it clearly has constrained the situation of many institutions, especially the ones that are less prestigious, more resource dependent, as the literature normally tells us. I think in recent years, none of this is particularly new, I would say. I mean, this has been around probably for the last 20 years. But I think recent years have been making this more difficult. One is what I think we could call a crisis of confidence in universities. I will not elaborate in many of these things. I will basically raise as topics for reflection and discussion. But the fact that although there were very high expectations regarding what universities could contribute, both in terms of social and economic progress and individual progress. And I think the last years have been denting this perception of this confidence because, for instance, the position of graduates in the labor market has become more diverse. So the promise is that all graduates would face a very positive situation in the labor market has become much more complex. The majority, I would say, do very well, but there is a minority, I would say a growing minority, doesn't do so well. In many ways, this would be an expected result given the massification and the level of participation that we have in higher education, given also the expansion of higher education, and in some cases expansion of low prestige institutions, lower quality institutions. But I think that inevitably has challenged many of these, in some ways, naive beliefs that existed about the contribution of higher education to economic progress. I think the fact that in many ways, increasingly higher education has been seen as an instrument that reproduces or even amplifies inequalities. I think it also challenged the liberal view that higher education would contribute to social cohesion, social mobility. And I would introduce something that is more present in the other volume, the regional dimension, that I think in some of European countries has become increasingly relevant. And I think a lot of the inequalities nowadays are also connected to regional inequalities, and the stratification of the system is also associated with growing inequalities within countries. And I think the fact that some parts of higher education are seen as forming this elite and reproducing economic elites rather than creating new elites, I think has been tremendously important for this. Some of you already alluded to one of the other dimensions that I think has been important to this, and this, of course, has been more visible in some countries than in others, but issues of nationalism, authoritarianism, polarization. In some ways, I would even dare to say anti-intellectualism. We all remember the comments, the debate at some point during Brexit, that we don't need more the opinion of experts. And the derision of the opinion of experts. Again, the pandemic, I think, has shown for some of us in shocking ways how some parts of our society are unwilling to accept the opinion of experts and the sort of professional and the legitimacy that comes with professional expertise and knowledge. And the way some governments have used this to undermine the symbolic value of higher education and university, I think, has been very important. I will not go into detail, but I think within the European Union, I think it's now very, very relevant in many large countries, and I think we need to be concerned. And I think this is even more concerning because of the disengagement of universities from public debate. I think the fact that many academics think that is not worthy to engage in public participation, public debate, what some of the literature calls the decline of public intellectuals. The fact that that doesn't pay off to contribute to this in terms of academic careers. The fact that many academics think that there is a huge opportunity cost for doing this regarding research outputs, I think has created a void that has been occupied in some cases by less qualified actors, and it has contributed to legitimize this view that universities are not interested in relevant social challenges because they are living in their own internal world, doing their own research games, and really they are detached from these concerns. The final remark that I would make in terms of this panorama of declining beliefs in institutional autonomy comes from within. One of the things that have been striking for me in the last 2 years has been the ambivalence that many within the university look at institutional autonomy. The fact that many academics and many students nowadays have ambiguous attitudes regarding institutional autonomy. Although in principle they will still support, I would say, institutional autonomy, when you discuss specific issues, quite often they would ask, well, the minister should interfere and should impose this to the universities. And I will not go into detail, although I'm sort of speaking in a foreign country. This has been streamed and recorded, as Simon said, so I probably should refrain from making some nasty comments. But I've been shocked by the amount of times that when we go to Parliament, different political parties from different parts of the political spectrum raise the issue that when we say, well, we're very sorry, but institutions are autonomous, and actually by law, this is a competence that they have. The attitude or the reaction is that, oh, you're just fighting this is just a lame excuse for not doing anything. And you're just giving them free rein for not taking a stance on some important issue. So in many ways, institutional autonomy has been seen as an obstacle for pursuing matters that are considered of public interest. And the attitudes that we find in academics, especially through, for instance, trade unions, that feel that the more autonomy you give to institutions, the more the rectors or the presidents will have the capacity to, for instance, differentiate the conditions of academics, define priorities that are not correspond to the preferences of some of the constituency. And I think that with students it's the same thing. There is a degree of mistrust among a growing number of academics and students regarding institutional autonomy that I think is very concerning. And that links to some of the issues that have been already discussed this morning about, communication and other dimensions that I will try to also to elaborate further. The second set of remarks that I would make is about this issue of convergence and divergence. We could go on for a long time about why should we expect convergence and divergence. What types of convergence and divergence are we talking about? And I think it was very interesting, especially this morning in the discussion, that we're talking about convergence and divergence between countries and within countries. And I think that makes the discussion more complicated, but also more interesting in many ways. And I probably will be more looking in terms of convergence and divergence within countries to illustrate why this, I think, makes much more complicated to answer the question about, should we expect more convergence or should we expect more divergence across Europe? We all know the debate again from the latter part of the 20th century about massification was associated with diversification, the different types of diversification that we're expecting, institutional, organizational, geographical, and so on and so forth. And the fact that, well, the larger and the more diverse the systems would become, the more complex the governance would become also at the system level. And in many ways, I think this mirrors the remark that Mike Shattuck was just making about, Warwick becoming so large. In many ways, that was the kind of rationale that justified the idea that the government should back off from detailed regulation and move to more sort of a supervisory role. So in many ways, this created a context where we would expect greater diversity within our systems, and even across Europe, because different countries have made different choices regarding this. Some have created binary systems, some have created even further diversity of institutions. France, for instance, would be one of the examples. We all remember the sort of almost kind of a joke that our colleagues would say, our French colleagues would say, that whenever a French government wanted to change something in the system, it created a new type of institution. So we had all these layers of institutions that coexisted. It made us, of course, all the system much more complicated. But then we had, I think, in the last 20, 25 years, a set of trends that I think have, in many ways, made this much more fuzzy and made this intention of having greater diversity in the system much more difficult to attain. One of that is related to things that some of you have been working for a long time, which is, of course, the effects of competition, benchmarking, rankings. And the fact that even institutions that whose legitimacy didn't depend in the past from this kind of assessment became increasingly concerned. The obvious examples would be the Grandes Écoles in France, again, institutions that have been so important in training the elites in France, but then became increasingly questioned by the fact that according to this set of criteria that were valued in many European universities, they wouldn't do very well because research was not part of their mission. And I think this has been particularly a concern for those systems like my system, where a new type of institutions was introduced in the latter part of the 20th century, sort of the vocational, non-university type of institutions that were not supposed to have a strong contribution or strong engagement in research. The fact that many of these institutions became increasingly compared, assessed according to this criteria, and this I think has been further exacerbated by the process of European integration. The fact that these institutions participated increasingly and collaborated with other institutions. And I mean, the case of the label of the branding of the non-university sector is clearly, I think, a vivid illustration of this. The fact that their names in their own language would not translate very well, and in some cases wouldn't mean very much. And the popularization of the term of University of Applied Sciences, I think, or Polytechnic University in recent years, I think it's clearly an attempt of how can we conform to a criteria that is understandable to our European partners. And this has been very often the argument, although I think that tries to address external and internal concerns, let's say foreign and domestic concerns. So in many ways, the fact that we emphasize more and more research as the golden standard through which we assess universities in Europe and higher education institutions in Europe, and I'm using explicitly universities and higher education institutions, I think has made convergence the forces towards convergence much stronger. At the same time, I think this has become more complicated because, let's say, traditional universities have been increasingly encouraged to engage more with their regions and the communities they serve. So in many ways, they become much more professional, vocationally oriented than used to be the case. So all the rhetoric about, the ivory tower and so on and so forth has been replicated again and again by policymakers, by challenging the position of some of these institutions. So in a very simplified term, we had these two sectors moving in converging directions. So the non-university sector becoming increasingly trying to mimic some of the dimensions that were more associated with universities, and some of the universities becoming more and more like, even in terms of the fields that they integrated, that were not traditionally fields that you would associate with university education, but because they would respond to local or regional needs. And I think that has made the landscape more and more complicated. I think I should, how am I doing in terms of time?
You're fine.
Okay. I will try to advance a little further in terms of why some of these things, especially regarding the both the decline of institutional autonomy and the sort of the convergence, divergence tensions have moved the way they've done, and I think why we should be concerned. I think when it comes to institutional governance, and this has been alluded already this morning in the debate, we have seen a shift in terms of distribution of power. And many of the governance reforms have tended towards what we would call the sort of increasing verticalization of decision making, the strengthening of central administration over professional or academic legitimacy. And this, I think, is not indifferent to the criticism towards institutional autonomy. So institutional autonomy has been seen increasingly as the autonomy of the rectors and presidents to decide according to their preferences. So the target moved from being the state, then being from being the state to becoming the institutional leaders. And actually, this is not surprising. I mean, if we go back to the old works of Burton Clark, Guy Neave, Roberto Moscati, we do remember this simplified exercise that they had, that the growth of the middle level, the sort of the institutional level of power, would be built not only by decentralizing power from the top level, let's say from the system level, but also from the bottom level. And the sort of the provocative remark that I remember from discussions many years ago, that a distant power is a much softer power. So the fact that many academics were controlled by someone located at the ministerial level, in many ways it felt as a much less interfering power than the central administration of its own institution. And I think that in many ways the way many of our systems have evolved, I think have tended towards this, and I think that shows that confirms that expectation. We do see as well that when we look at the results from surveys with academics, that they feel that a lot of these tendencies have been led by external regulatory forces, not necessarily by government, but also by regulatory agencies, sort of funding agencies, research agencies, quality assurance agencies. I think in many ways this has been more nuanced, and that's why the perception about these changes, I think, has been also more diluted and over time. The trend towards a culture of centrally managed processes supported by external requests. Although I have to say, in defense of some of these processes, that I think the degree of self-knowledge, the degree of self-coordination, I think, has clearly improved in recent years. But I think this is clearly needs to be balanced by the way this is taking place internally. Regarding the role of academics and students, I have mixed feelings about some of the statements. I think on the surface, I'm quite often confronted by this view that academics and students have less power and less influence in decision-making processes. But this is, again, more complex. I think this is very unequal. I would say that some academics and some students nowadays have more power in their own institutions than many of the previous ones. One of the concerns that I have is that this has become concentrated in a small share of students and academics. And actually, when it comes to academics, they have power not only internally, but mediated by these externally regulatory forces. Some of these people are precisely the people that participate in reviewing committees in quality agencies, in research funding agencies, and so on and so forth. And the fact that they are prominent in terms of institutional governance quite often makes them likely candidates to be co-opted to be part of these committees. So in many ways, their influence is exercised not only in their own institution, but in other institutions. And so, I think that the work, for instance, of someone like Michel Lamont, I think is very important in this respect for a very different context. But I've a view, and Christine Musselin has also worked about this in a very thoughtful way, and this has been resonating with me in many instances when I face the same people in many of these instances, in many of these debates, and in many of these bodies. So when we say, as a whole, academics and students have less power and less influence, I think we need to qualify which group are we talking about. So I mean, I accept that in formal terms, there has been a decline in participation of academics, non-academics, and students in decision-making process. But then, you know, if we go institution by institution, the picture would become more complex. Just an illustration of that. The fact that, for instance, in my own country, as in many other countries, we move from a system where instead of having a large electoral body electing the rector or the president, and having a smaller body of maybe 20 people, 30 people electing the rector or the president, would on paper suggest that we have, they have less influence. My experience is that academics seldom stay as a bloc. So quite often they will tend to divide themselves into different factions because they have different views about the institution. And the students quite often will stay as a bloc and will vote as a bloc. So my experience in many institutions is that the students have been absolutely decisive in selecting the winning candidate. And they've bargained, and they are aware of their bargaining power, and they've used this to choose and to extract advantages in that respect. So that precise group of students, a different question would be, how representative are these students from the student state? How aligned are their preferences and their priorities regarding the constituency they are supposed to represent? But this would apply to any of the other states. And I mean, another issue that we could elaborate that I think we don't have time would be the increasing crisis of legitimacy and participation regarding student representation. That I think is a significant issue. The fact that many of our students have alienated themselves from decision-making process. I think this is the levels of participation in elections, in student elections. I think in some cases are absolutely dismal. Even in countries that used to have a very strong tradition of student participation. But the fact that this small group has, in many ways, a decisive vote in this election, I think, in many ways, question to what this simplification that students, because they are in a smaller number, they have less influence and power in the decision-making process. The other concerns, and I would like to finish soon so that we have more time for discussion. One of the problems that I have with academic participation, well, I have several problems with academic participation, but one of the main concerns is that again and again we are confronted with this nostalgia of a golden era of collegiality that I'm afraid to say I don't think it has ever existed. And by the way, even in the instances where this collegiality is sustained, for instance at the departmental level, I don't know what has been your experience, but in different levels of decision making in different institutions, I've been confronted with the attitude is normally how nice that the meeting was so short. And let's move on and do this thing very quickly. And whenever someone that is chairing the committee wants to provoke a more thorough discussion, he or she is normally confronted with the attitude that it's very nice, but we don't have time for that. So we are in this sort of almost schizophrenic situation that our colleagues increasingly call for more participation, more discussion, more reflection in order to be more engaged, but at the same time very much unwilling to devote the amount of time that is required to do this. So I'm not so sure. We are at the moment, for instance, discussing, and some of you have participated in debates in public debates that we organize in Portugal about our basic law on education that will structure a lot of, or restructure a lot of the governance at the system level and institutional level. And we have seen the level of participation in many cases. No, it hasn't been bad. Quite often we would get, 100 people, 200 people. But for system discussion, and quite often which people have mobilized, and in many ways they are the usual suspects, people that are engaged, they are interested, they have institutional roles. So I'm particularly concerned at this idea that let's go back to the time where we have half students, half academics in academic governance, or we have larger bodies that will make our institutions much better than they are at the moment. It doesn't mean that I think we should be satisfied with the results of our current models of governance. And I think many of the things that have been introduced in terms of reforms, I think, well, I'm hesitant to say if it was a failure or it was just, or it didn't have any impact. I mean, when we think about the role of external stakeholders, and I'm looking at Bjorn because he's been working a lot about this, so I learn a lot. From what I'll say has been learned a lot from his results, but in many ways it didn't make any difference to have external stakeholders. Largely because I don't think that many of our institutions know what to expect from them. Quite often what we want is people that are well known, with high level of public recognition, but I think there is a problem in terms of the process of selection and the expectations regarding these people. I think that in many ways, the decision-making process to select the leadership, both at the top level and intermediate level, also didn't make so much difference. I mean, it had an impact in terms of an increasing level of coordination, in terms of possibly some growing degree of alienation in academics and non-academics and students. But I'm not convinced that it made such a large difference. So in many ways, the reforms were a failure because it didn't produce the impact that many were expecting. So to conclude, I will just raise a set of questions that I've been concerned in recent years that I'll leave it as for discussion. In many ways, we are in a difficult position because probably we haven't had a time in our history in the history of universities in Europe where universities were so visible and the expectations were so significant. Of course, the fact that we have so many people nowadays, the amount of resources devoted to higher education is so large, is related to that. But for me, the question is, how do we balance this degree of expectations and this centrality of higher education in Europe with the protection of institutional autonomy? I mean, the more relevant or the higher social and political expectations regarding universities, the more likely is that we will have political and social interference in higher education. Especially because of this perception that if we don't do this, they will not behave as we like or as we want. And I think that, how do we balance this being a very relevant institution, as universities are in Europe, still very much regarded, and at the same time being sufficiently protected and having the autonomy to say, well, trust us that we will be able to pursue, the public interests in organizing in the ways that we think are more concerned. The second concern that I would share with you is, how do we balance this pressure for having more and more higher education? Because in many of our countries, the targets are even to increase more participation. And that associated with this increased participation, because it becomes more and more difficult to attract traditional students, we need to attract a more diverse population. So in many ways, the conclusion is that in order to bring more diverse population, we need to have more diverse institutions. How do we balance this with the pressures that I already mentioned about institutional isomorphism? And I think that it's very difficult to impose, especially in a context of, autonomy, that institutions stay diverse with the kind of forces that we have operating in the sector. So that's also, again, one of the drivers for growing political interference, is to sustain that diversity, because the perception among many policymakers that if you don't do anything, this diversity will be increasingly diluted and institutions will become more alike. So the purpose for the establishment of these institutions will not be fulfilled. Last two comments. One of the concerns that I have is about the system cohesiveness. And I think that increasingly it has become difficult to define policies at the system level with the degree of stratification that we have in many of our systems. I think in many ways, this is politically much more, I'm thinking about what could be an adequate word, palatable, adequate, acceptable in the British context than it is in continental Europe. I think in continental Europe, the idea that you politically state that not all institutions are treated in the same way is still much more problematic than I think it would be in the British case. But I think increasingly it is the case. And even if we could question the effects of the excellence initiatives and so on, we do have a growing stratification of institutions in many systems that used to have a tradition, especially in the post-war era, of equality and egalitarian treatment of institutions. The idea that part of the duty of the state was to provide the same quality of education regardless of the region where people were based. And this was also a force towards social cohesion and social equality. And I think that's the tensions there between being capable of defining guidelines and policies at the system level, and at the same time then taking actions that really make this much more complicated. I think it's one of the big tensions in terms of policy making. And the final remark that I would make is about sort of internal participation. And I think the comment that was made before about communication, I think is relevant for this, but I think we need to go beyond that. I think a lot of the discussion in terms of institutional governance is about formal participation, and I'm much more concerned about substantive participation. The sort of the provocative comments that I make about the sort of this bland collegiality that quite often, or this diluted collegiality that we have, or in some ways irresponsible collegiality that we have in many of our institutions, show that we need to think harder about how do we re-engage our colleagues. And I think the comments that Mike was just making about digitalization, I think are very relevant. I think the pandemic has exacerbated this because it has made many of our colleagues even more detached from the institution. I think the emphasis in research and research as a criteria for recognition of peers, I think it again has eroded even further the attachment of many of our colleagues to the institution, because the benchmark is not internally defined, is external. And I think that's one of the challenges that I would say that we have is how do we reinvigorate levels of participation in a way that is, I think it's a dead end to go back to the old regime. I think we need to find new ways of governing institutions that are adjusted to realities that are the ones that we're facing nowadays. And I don't have a good answer for that. But that's maybe one of the motivations for coming here, is because I'm listening to experts and researchers in the field. But I think that would be one major contribution that we as a research community could give to policymakers at this stage, is how to think in innovative ways of promoting much more substantive collegiality in our institutions. And I think I should stop there. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Pedro, and that was very rich, and I think there's plenty there for our panel of authors to respond to. I'm going to exercise the chair's privilege once today and raise a larger question which I think affects this discussion. And I want to take advantage of the fact that you are an economist of education as well as a minister. I think that double perspective is really helpful in addressing the problem I'm about to raise, and I think you will have thought about it quite a bit. It's been troubling me increasingly. I want to take the long view, the larger question about this relationship between the outside pressures on the higher education and the question of autonomy, a word which is increasingly inadequate and which we need to start to break open and put some adjectives on and start to differentiate between different kinds of autonomy. That's something if we have time, I'll come back to. But my problem is this. I think increasingly the expectation in government, in the community, broadly speaking, amongst families, is that what we do in higher education is we prepare people for work, prepare people for professions, occupations, and the labour market. The Australian government, minus one, the previous Australian government, developed the notion of job-ready graduates, which I thought in a very kind of crude and direct way captures this common view. And I think what we see there is the rolling out of a kind of human capital view of the world, the sort of Gary Becker view of understanding of people and of education has become increasingly soaked into the general culture, if you like. And massification, of course, ensures that this focus on the labour market preparation role becomes ever more important. It's not only important in terms of the economy and efficiency, economic growth, it's important in terms of opportunity, in that by focusing on preparing people for work, we help people who are perhaps upwardly mobile from disadvantaged backgrounds achieve a better place in society than their parents had. So all of that is happening, and it seems to me quite irresistible in some respects. Now, the problem is this. Increasingly, that model, if you like, of what we should be doing is in people's minds. But if you were going to achieve this objective and you were starting from nothing, and I'm thinking of what a good policymaker would do in constructing an education system from the ground up, if you like, you would not have the Humboldtian model. You would not have teaching research nexus. You probably would not have education that focused on disciplinary knowledge. You would not have certainly classrooms that taught people in disciplines which have no relationship with work, or only an indirect or attenuated relationship with work. You would probably not have these very large institutions. You would certainly not have the sort of various interlaying traditions of institutional and academic autonomy that they currently have. You would probably ensure more directly that they were going to do what you thought they should be doing, which is developing human capital for labour markets. But the problem is that we do have that kind of institution. And so it seems to me that increasingly it's going to be problematized as a social endeavour, that its forms, not just its autonomy, that's the first stage of the problem, its forms themselves are not appropriate to achieve the objectives which governments, corporations, families, and some students at least, I mean others perhaps are focused on their own personal formation, but some students at least would see as the primary work of the university. So we have a case of irresistible force, which is this expectation, growing stronger, and the immovable object, which is the university inherited from the medieval tradition. But is it an immovable object? I mean, what's the future of the endeavour? And so I think that's the question of autonomy is, if you like, the first stage of breaking open the problem of where's it going as a social institution. And it's necessary to break down its autonomy to address the problem. And the desire to address the problem will ensure that there'll be increasing pressure on autonomy.
Thank you so much. I still will make a comment about the autonomy thing, because I think it's, although you you said you wouldn't elaborate on that, but I think that's one of the, I would say one of the crucial issues that we need to elaborate further in types of autonomy and the interplay of these four types of autonomy. And I think one of the concerns that we should have is that even though probably we'll be more protected in the academic level dimensions of autonomy, how far can we go if we don't have institutional autonomy regarding other dimensions like, you know, management, human resources, and so on and so forth? So I think it's very difficult that you can talk about a really autonomous institution if then you are so much constrained by, for instance, by resources, because that will inevitably mold the way that you use your academic autonomy. And I think that one of the things that had made this process in some ways more subtle, but more influential in the way our institutions operate, is because it has clearly shaped through regulatory forces, through funding, through quality assessment, the core missions of higher education. So even though you can always say, well, the Constitution ensures that you know, we have academic freedom and we have pedagogical and scientific autonomy, I think this is rather toothless if then you need to adjust to a set of criteria that are defined externally, either because of the resources you need or because of the standards that you need to abide. The other question about human capital, we could go on a long time, but I'll try to control myself. I think the expectation that higher education would contribute significantly to social advancement and to individual advancement has been extremely important to have the levels of participation that we have nowadays. We cannot make the counterfactual, but I don't think we would be able to have as many people studying in higher education as we have in our countries without this kind of strong argument, without this instrumental view about higher education.
Great.
The problem is that the landscape has become much more complex. I think the position, as I just briefly alluded in my comments, the landscape for graduates has become more and more unequal. On average, and for the large majority, I think it's still a very advantageous position. So it's still, I would say for almost all of them, they are still better off for having more education. And I think we need to be careful about the emphasis on the problems, because I think quite quickly, the media and many of policymakers don't like sort of very nuanced and very complex arguments. So they will just retain the part that is not worth it. So that what's the point of going to higher education? That will be the answer. I think it's still very much, even from a purely economic perspective, worthwhile. But actually, if we go back to the original statements in terms of human capital, even Becker, which was probably the most instrumental of all of them, he will talk about general human capital and specific human capital. That some of the role of education is to provide general skills that, because they can be used in multiple circumstances, in many ways are public good. So they need to be supported by this kind of institutions, because, for instance, a company will not provide you this kind of, will not invest in this kind of generic skills, because actually this will make you more valuable, and you can go to another company that didn't have the cost of investing in you and can reap the benefits. And that's why for a long time the discussion has been, you know, the education system should be focusing more in generic skills and leave the more specialized ones, the ones that are intrinsic to a specific job, to either to the ones that receive this training, and the idea of cost sharing, I think, is very much also related to this, but also to the ones that will benefit the employers. Part of the difficulty, I think, is that institutions, and in this case, I will be more explicit, universities have turned this into very much part of their rhetoric. In many ways, I think part of the discourse of university leaders nowadays leave aside or play down the role of university education as a formative experience, as personal development. And I challenge you to, to scrutinize the discourse of many of the leaders, and they have engaged. And actually, one of the criticisms that I quite often have to face from, for instance, from the polytechnic sector is that, well, but universities are becoming very much like us. So they are the ones also assuming a vocational role that they were not supposed to have. So, it's not only us that are becoming more and academically oriented, it's also them they are becoming. I think to add on to the tensions and the complexity, I think one of the difficulties is this duality of criteria for legitimacy. It's very complicated for university nowadays that on the one hand needs to impress the public opinion and policymakers by saying we are in position X of Shanghai ranking or whatever ranking you want, which doesn't reflect at all many of these contributions to the region, to the labor market, employability of graduates, and so on and so forth. And then at the same time respond and legitimize themselves to the regional powers and to the national policymakers on the basis of something that is not that. So I think part of the difficulty is that we're trying to do too many things at the same time. And we think that we are able as universities to perform well according to what I think in many ways are contradictory criteria. And I think that's, I don't see an easy way out of this. Yes. But because if we refuse and we say, oh, it's not important, our contribution, what happens to our graduates, we'll lose legitimacy and we'll lose social and political support for the degree of participation that we have and for the degree of funding that we have in terms of higher education, especially in Europe.
I think that's a pretty good first answer to my question. The point I'm making in simple terms is that we are engaged in 3 or 4 year degrees in a process of cultural formation, like schooling, basically. And the expectation that's created by the end result question is that we should be engaged in a process of, I think, both general and specific vocational formation, as you've said. I'm sure Gary Becker believes that liberal education contributes to, if you like, general vocational formation. And there is something of an argument there, of course, especially in relation to personal agency, thinking, confidence and those things. But really, if you were going to have a successful vocational general institution, you wouldn't use cultural formation as your principal mechanism. That's the point I'm trying to make. And it seems to me that, as you say, I think is complex, but it goes on becoming a problem and a bigger problem. But I won't hijack the discussion any further. And I think Jürgen has something he wants to say about this issue, and we'll bring you in too.
How can I say? I just want to say that I think we should be careful, and I put it very strongly now, not to take neoliberal rhetoric that is, by the way, not necessarily an international phenomenon, about the job readiness and employability and all the rest of it, as if it would be matter of fact. What I'm trying to say is universities will never be able to produce job-ready graduates. Because even if you ask employers, they do not know what they want or need in 4 or 5 years. And that is where we come from. Second, the responsibility for placement of graduates on labor markets is not to universities. How can I say, the universities can do very little about the fact that you have a global financial crisis and labor markets break down, right? There is much more going on that is beyond the responsibility of universities. And I think what I see certainly in England, and I would guess also in Australia, as I'm sure in the US, is that actually conservative governments use this as a blame game. They push the blame for problems on the graduate labor markets over to the universities. You know, and especially when I look at England, we don't have a labor market policy, we don't have an industry policy, because all of that is, of course, in miraculous ways sorted out by the market. So who is to blame? Well, certainly not the government, certainly not the market, but the universities. And I think we should be very sensitive and careful about these kind of dynamics in this discussion, that we as researchers buy not too easily into it.
Yeah, thank you very much.
I'm totally committed to the Humboldt.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Patricia Hoyer, and I would like to, first of all, thank you all. I have really been enjoying it this morning. Albeit, I have to say, it resonated with terms that I heard of ambiguity and mixed feelings, and maybe also a bit of worry in terms of where's this all going. But what also resonated with me was this call to, have a little bit of trust as well. So the trust that the academic ethos and this cultural formative potential, that it will not die, also not in this massification and all the external pressures that are there. I want to share one little reaction or just a reflection and also have a question. So one of the reflection was, so this, let's say, globalization project, the idea of the European University, seems to have failed somehow. If Bologna and all these reforms are a little bit on the retreat and we see more national autonomy, but really the central term of autonomy also kind of brought this question of whose autonomy. So if you go for convergence, does that not always mean there's a restriction of someone's autonomy, be it the national autonomy? If we have national autonomy, does that maybe restrict the universities, because then, they have to play along with the national regime? If it's the university's autonomy, we heard it's the rectors who have the say and no longer the academics. If it's the academics who have the autonomy, what about the students' voice? So it's always, autonomy seems to always restrict also the freedom of something else. And that was the reflection part. And my question is a little bit, when I think of it in terms of convergence or globalization, having a European standard on the basis of research output or, accreditation, for me, that was also, and this is where my research interest comes in, an enabler of mobility for academics, for students to move around in Europe and get the same degree or be able to employ, to work in same conditions. And I have a bit of a feeling that with, that the trend is also going back for mobility in terms of, I just take the example of the Netherlands, where internationalization was a big thing, recruiting people from abroad, and suddenly they realized, oh no, that's what we don't want anymore. Stay home, So I don't know, maybe this was not so much the focus of the study that you conducted, but maybe you also have a view on how this will impact mobility and whether we're going to get less and less diverse student bodies, less and less diverse faculties, and going back to national kingdoms.
I think we're, I mean, I don't know where the questions are. Are they coming from the, no, they're not. We don't have anything from the online audience anymore.
I think Bjorn wanted to say something.
Yeah.
Thank you, Pedro. It was a very good keynote, a very reflective keynote, and there were a lot of interesting take-home messages there. A little bit, you had some reflections, historical reflections. And in the end, you came up with a very critical approach towards collegialism and you know, the glorious past when it comes to collegialism. At the same time, you started out with, you know, almost saying that, oh, we have a decline in autonomy here. And you could imagine that what you were thinking then was the glorious past of the totally autonomous university. But I think, you know, at which point in history are you looking back at? Because I think if we do look back at least European higher education development after World War II, there is plenty of evidence for quite interventionist government actions when it comes to developing a vocational sector in the 1960s and the expansion that we saw in the 90s and so forth. So it's just a reflection on the autonomy and how the autonomy has changed. Because for me, that's the interesting question, not whether it has been high autonomy or low autonomy, but how the autonomy, the concept of autonomy has changed in history. That would be interesting to hear your reflections about. Thank you.
I'm going to invite the panel, the editors or the authors, sorry, to respond to Pedro, and I think ask Pedro to make the final comment, if that's okay. Yeah. Okay. Please feel free. The mic to the mic.
Well, I'd like to pick up the last statement about autonomy, if I may. I think one of the things that's, as it were, impressed in us all mentally as that universities are organizations which are intended to make people free to think what they want to think. And the whole concept of autonomy was all about, as it were, academic freedom. And the difficulty of Simon's perspective of the human capital view of universities and so forth is that it suggests that universities are being regulated in some way or constrained. And I think that's difficult where society is changing so rapidly that what we should be doing is training undergraduates to think and to be part of this changing world. And the reason why governance is important is governance is a way of putting some sort of shape and organization on the activities of academics to produce new thinking. And I think we've got to be very careful about, as it were, governments taking on university research and trying to control it. Just as I think it'd be very dangerous for us to have governments playing a large part in designing undergraduate education. I think unless we keep universities, relatively speaking, free, then I don't mean free in a monetary sense, but in an intellectual sense, then in fact, part of the problem that Pedro was talking about is going to be made worse. It's imperative, it seems to me, that if an institution is called a university, it should have teaching and research as it were, equal components. And that's the way you build a really good system, and that's the way higher education can make its contribution to society.
Yes, why not? I mean, first of all, I would like to thank you, Pedro, for this really very interesting and quite encompassing keynote that you gave to us. We discuss all kinds of things over coffee. I thought I want to respond to you. And I have, what can I say? I just want to point at something. I think what we are experiencing in more and more countries is this nationalist, populist, more isolationist, xenophobic, and I could continue like that, political rise, while at the same time, global capitalism is roaming freely. So what I'm trying to say here, and Britain with Brexit would be a good example for that we have quite a paradox, or seemingly, and I think it's not really contradictory, developments of closure on the national level on the one hand, that at the same time allows international capitalist dynamics to continue. So there's something we need to look at to understand where, how can I say, the political economy is. And that, of course, reflects back on higher education. That is always the case, you know, that and higher education is in this world just like that. You know, it's just one aspect of so many others, and not really specifically targeted, I think.
No, I'm fine. Let's just give some coffee time for people, because otherwise we really run out of time. We should be starting the panel by now.
Then it remains, Pedro, for you to...
It's me between you and the coffee.
Yeah.
Nice. No pressure. No, 3 quick points. I absolutely agree with Bjorn in the sense that in many ways institutional autonomy is an episode in a history that is much more of state governance and state interference rather than state strong regulation. I think in many ways we had very high expectations. We had expectations that giving more autonomy to institutions, they will be stronger institutions. They will be more relevant institutions. And I think there are many dimensions through which we can say that that has been fulfilled. But I think some of the things that we've been discussing this morning show that in many dimensions, institutions have been too reactive and being unable to have a discourse that in some cases contradicts or corrects or challenges some of the beliefs that some of our colleagues have just mentioned. I don't think that many policymakers will be disturbed by the idea that, well, we're not just, training units. My concern in some ways is that in many of the discourses of university leaders, I find this discourse.
Yes.
So the ones that would have the greater responsibility to say, what is our mission? What are we trying to achieve? Why, in order to be relevant in the long term, we cannot respond only to short-term needs, be it labor market needs or other types of needs, are the ones that in many ways are legitimizing this short-term view of the role of the university. And it was very interesting, the comment about the sort of the European dimension that in many ways was not present. In order to continue the sort of the provocative role, I'm not too confident that the supranational, the European level of governance would be better for most institutions. And actually the way many of our universities behave regarding European initiatives, it's again very reactive and very accommodative to those. I actually think that the European integration process at the higher education level would lead actually to greater polarization and greater stratification. But that would be, it would be a long discussion, but I think there are good arguments to show. And for instance, I just came yesterday from at the EIE meeting, a discussion about European alliances, which is, as you know, it's the hot topic. It's now the new fashion in town in European debates. And one of the remarks that I've been making some of these political events is that, well, what's the purpose? Why are institutions joining this? In order to provoke them, and not just to be part because our neighbors are already part of an alliance, so I also want to be part of an alliance. Or because everyone is, so this is the new game in town, so that's for, we just add this to our portfolio of international activities. So the behavior, and that's why my concern about having stronger institutions is institutions that think more thoroughly about why are they doing something and why are they not doing other things? Why are they making choices? And my concern is that many universities nowadays don't make choices. And the disengagement and the sort of the bland collegiality of our colleagues actually contributes to this. The fact that many of them, as long as they are not disturbed in terms of their publications and their normal life, they're fine. And anything that distracts them from that it's a burden. I think that can, and then they find themselves surprised that, you know, the institution is governed in the way in which they have less and less influence. So I think that, you know, in order that the institutional autonomy is not just an historical interlude, I think our discussion should be, how can we make institutions stronger? I think we had the expectations that through institutional autonomy, we would motivate more participation of students, academics, in a sense that would be a stronger organization. And my concern is that the limited capacity of many of our institutions and many of our institutional leaders to put forward a coherent view about what we do and why do we have to behave in a certain way, I think is contributing to weaken our institutions and our capacity to challenge some of these established views. Okay, I think I should stop.
Thank you very much, Pedro. It's really good that you're able to join us today and contribute so much in the short time that we've had. Colleagues, we now have the opportunity to contemplate our autonomy in a conversational manner over the coffee break, and we'll take the coffee break, I think, a little shorter than planned.